Today's episode is the next to last in season 1 of Letting Grow, and today I'm finally talking about our rebirth out of the COVID Bardo state we've all been in. No matter how long it takes for us all to move on to some kind of new normal, eventually we'll be able to meet friends and go to the gym and do so many of the things we used to do. If we stop now and reflect on what we've learned about ourselves and what matters to us, it'll help us to live more intentionally in the after times, not just try to get back to the before times. Welcome to Letting Grow, the podcast about one of the spiritual journey's most difficult and courageous moments, letting go of who we think we should be so we can grow into who we most deeply are. I'm your host, Claire Villarreal, and I appreciate your joining me today. This is the next to last episode of season 1 of Letting Grow, and I kind of assumed that at some point during season 1, we would be kind of coming out of the COVID Bardo state, this in-between state where everything's been just kind of frozen and it feels like time is no longer passing and whatnot. So this is not that episode. We are not really coming out of COVID yet. In some places, folks are getting fully vaccinated, and some folks are sort of coming out of these lockdown modes. And also some people have never been taking it seriously from the beginning, so they never were in a lockdown. But for a lot of us, the light at the end of the tunnel is still kind of a ways off. So I'm just going to record this episode now and hope that before too long, we can all be thinking about how to have this rebirth and come out of this COVID Bardo state that we have all collectively been in. And my intention with this episode today really is to offer a few reflections from the Tibetan teachings on rebirth to help all of us think about this rebirth process that is whatever it looks like to come into a new normal state after the end of this pandemic. There are 3 things that I want to talk about in today's episode. The first one is clarification, that going through a death and rebirth process clarifies what's really important to us, who we really are. The second one is that intentions matter. This is very deeply woven into the Buddhist tradition and the Tibetan tradition, that prayers and aspirations and intentions for what we want to do in the future really can help to shape where we're going. And the third thing is, even though we might think of coming out of the COVID Bardo state as like a return to normal, really the new is never the old. There's always something different about who we are in our new iteration or our new lifetime than who we were. There's continuity, but there's also difference. So I want to start with the first one, which is clarification. If this is your first time listening to this podcast and you don't really know what I'm talking about with Bardo states and Tibetan Buddhist teachings and stuff like that, I would recommend going back and starting with the second episode in the feed. It's the first full episode. It's an overview of the Bardo states and transitions. And if you listen to that first, you'll have a better sense of what I'm talking about in terms of the death and rebirth process. So having said that, if you are familiar with the 4 stages of death and rebirth, and these are covered earlier in this season, but they are the death process. So from the beginning of the time when we begin to actively die, when our body starts shutting down, our energy system starts shutting down, that's the death process. And it ends and kind of opens into the next Bardo state, which is the Bardo of clear light. And this is when our ordinary self, our body, our ordinary mind has all dissolved away, and we are left with just our ultimate mind, our true nature. And it's apparent to us fully, clearly, and also because it is so different from our ordinary sense of self, most of us don't recognize it as that. And we sort of pass out and we wake up into the next Bardo state, which is called the Bardo of becoming. And this is the time between the end of the death process, the end of the Bardo of clear light, and the beginning of the next lifetime. And really it's a time of, in the beginning, associating more with that old lifetime that's just passed, And then toward the middle of this, we begin to have more dreamlike experiences, more encounters with our own mind, just creating experiences or creating a world. And then toward the end of the Bardo of Becoming, we get drawn toward whatever our next lifetime is going to be, which then leads us to the fourth Bardo state, which actually is traditionally presented first, but I'm presenting it fourth here, which is the Bardo of this life. So this life begins when that Bardo being, that disembodied being from the Bardo of Becoming, is drawn into its next lifetime, its next rebirth. And the traditional teaching is that, for instance, if you're going to be a human in your next lifetime, you would be this disembodied Bardo being who then sees your parents to be making love, and you're drawn to them, and you bloop, like somehow get joined together with the egg and the sperm, and the fertilization happens, and you're now off and running on a new lifetime. So that's the Bardo of this lifetime, and that then lasts from the moment of conception all the way up to the time that we begin to die. Incidentally, the research on reincarnation suggests that this is not necessarily the way it always happens. Like some children are born and they remember previous lives from people who maybe died a month before the child was born, or even just a few days before the child was born. Or in a couple of like really bizarre cases, the previous personality actually died after the child was born, but often they were really sick or something like that toward the end of their life. But anyway, it's this fourth Bardo state, the Bardo of this life, and the way we kind of get drawn into that, the way that it begins when we click with our new parents, and then really it unfolds, it begins to unfold during the gestation process. So it begins with this tiny little, very, very subtle being, and then you grow physically, and your body's energy system develops, your mind develops. And I think really all of that is a great metaphor for the way that a new phase or a new chapter in our life begins. It usually begins with our interest in something or just a curiosity about something, and then we explore it a bit more. And if we decide that's where we want to go, we start investing our resources, we start investing our time and our energy. And before we know it, we've really begun to put all the pieces in place for a new identity, a new self. And I imagine, because there's a pattern to transition, there's a pattern to rebirth, I imagine that our rebirth out of this COVID state is probably going to be something like that for a lot of us, where possibilities begin to open up again for us to maybe go in to work in person, or maybe we can start going back to yoga classes or to the gym or to meditation classes, whatever we were doing, or meeting up with friends. Like, we're going to have more options on the table. And probably, I would imagine for most people, it's going to be a slow process of beginning to decide what feels safe, what do I want to do. And it offers a lot of opportunities for deciding who we want to be going forward. But in this first point that I want to talk about, this clarification point, what I want to focus on is that during the process of death and this in-between state, as described in Tibetan teachings, it's really a process of stripping down the identity that we think we had and getting all the way to the deepest layer of ourselves. And the reason I think that's applicable here is that for a lot of us, we've kind of undergone a stripping down process during this Bardo of COVID, where the things we used to do, the people we used to see, the places we used to go to, even eating out in restaurants, all these things for many of us were just really not possible for a long time. And it forces us, or at least for me, I'll speak from my own experience, I've had a lot less social contact with other people, but it's forced me to really think about who are the most important people in my life. Like, who do I want to make sure that I am getting contact with on a regular basis? And I've been better. I'm still not super great about staying in touch with a lot of the people who really matter to me, but two of the things that I've done and my family has done is to have two different sort of family group calls. One is with my cousins and more extended family, and one is just my immediate family. But it's been really nourishing and really helpful to kind of have the time, to set aside the time to spend with people I care about, and not just as I would have done in the past. I kind of end up spending my time here and there, going out to restaurants, doing things that are fun. But I don't live remotely close to most of the people in my family, so I wasn't really seeing them or having contact with them on a regular basis. So for me, this COVID Bardo state and not being able to kind of just casually go out in the evening and visit with people or go do something together, it's really forced me to think, okay, who are the important people in my life? Who do I want to spend time with? And how am I going to make that happen? And I'm not filling up my time. I haven't been filling up my time with social stuff because you can't right now. But I think that's one way that this sort of COVID Bardo state has been like the death process as described in the Bardo teachings, that it's really taken so much from us, but it's also, for me at least, and I think from a lot of people that I've also spoken with about this, it's helped us to recognize what is important, what we want to spend our time on, who we want to stay connected with. And the other aspect of this that I just want to mention while we're on the topic of the COVID Bardo state, if you will, and the whole death process is that loss and grief are actually really important in this process. I think a lot of us would prefer to skip over really resting with or acknowledging the losses that we have as something is ending and something else is beginning. But in this COVID time, we've had such tremendous collective losses, like the loss of the ability to go into work, to see other people, to hug people, to shake people's hands, just this tremendous loss of like contact with other humans that we as humans really need. We've lost the ability to travel freely between borders. I am from Texas. I married a Canadian, and now I've moved up here. I've got permanent residence in Canada. And my whole sort of model for my life was based on the idea that I could travel freely back and forth between the US and Canada. And I can cross the borders, but I have to quarantine myself every time I do. And it's inconvenient to take a couple of weeks and just not see anyone else. And it's also just very isolating. I've done it a bunch of times now. I am not a huge fan of doing it again if I don't have to. And it just complicates things. On top of our collective losses, there have also just been so many people who have lost someone, a person, or lost a job, lost income, lost security. I mean, think about the discrimination and harassment that a lot of Asian and Pacific Islander people are facing, at least in the US. Like, there have just been really personal losses, and we're not just going to come out of this COVID Bardo state and have those losses be undone. Like, our world has been changed. And personally, I think we may have to come out of this state and try and live like we normally would have in the before times to actually realize how much we have lost and how much has changed. So I just wanted to highlight that as something that is real and a challenge that I think for a lot of us we haven't fully faced yet, what we've lost collectively and personally. Hi friends, want to join the Letting Grow tribe? I'll be starting a bi-weekly newsletter in early 2021 with links to articles, YouTube videos, other podcasts, and basically the best of the rebirth content I've come across lately. Some examples of the kinds of things I want to share with you include a snap judgment story about a bull who seemed to be the reincarnation of another bull, a viral article about the creepy things kids say, but some of them 100% seem to refer to previous lives, and some excerpts from the book I'm writing now about the lessons Tibetan Buddhist teachings on life and death offer to those of us going through transitions. Spoiler alert, that's all of us. Best of all, if you're subscribed, you'll get links to join free live video calls with me and other subscribers every couple of months. So pause this episode now, find the newsletter sign-up link in the show notes, and join your tribe. Moving on to the second point, that intentions really do matter, I want to come back to and kind of underscore the idea that in really all forms of Buddhism that I'm aware of, but definitely in Tibetan Buddhism, intentions are really, really important, and aspirations and prayers. And prayers not necessarily in the sense of like Christian prayers where you're praying to a deity, but prayers in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, where they're aspiration prayers, they're often what you would say at the end of a practice session when you're sort of dedicating your merit, which basically just means that you're thinking of what do you actually want this practice to add up to. So say you sit and you meditate for 15 minutes, and before you get up out of that practice and finish that session, you can just take a moment and reflect on who do I want to be for having done this practice. And in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a real sense that when we make these kinds of aspirations and we kind of put some oomph behind it, like we're not just sitting down having done nothing and we think like, oh, may I become enlightened for the benefit of all beings. Like, no, we sit down, we put in the work, and then we also reflect before we get up from having done the work, so to speak, in that session. Like, what do I want this practice to be orienting me toward? So those aspiration prayers are really important because they kind of keep us on track, or you might say they set us in a certain direction. Like if we have this momentum in the direction of waking up, like fully waking up out of all delusions and being able to liberate all living beings from their delusions so that nobody suffers anymore. Like we might not get there in this lifetime, but at least we know that we're headed in that direction. And I think we can also apply this to the moment that we're in now when we're kind of getting ready to come out of this. I hope we're getting ready to come out of this coronavirus Bardo state, but we're not fully out yet. And in the last section, I talked about some of the important things or connections or values that we realize are important to us during a sort of death process. Well, as we're coming out into our next lifetime, this is the time to reflect on what is important. Who do we want to be next? And in Mind Beyond Death, Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche compares the death process and like going on to our next lifetime to taking a trip. So I'm going to extend his trip metaphor and kind of compare this aspect of making aspirations in our Dharma practice to saving and getting ready to go on a trip. And when I think and talk about a trip, really what I'm talking about is our journey into our next phase of life. To give a concrete example, after I graduated from high school, my family went on a trip to Europe. Like my parents wanted to kind of introduce us to Europe, introduce us to travel. We camped most of the places where we were, so it was not a super luxurious or glamorous trip to Europe, but it was super fun. And it was kind of like our last trip together as a family before I left home. So anyway, we spent a lot of time preparing for this, saving up for it, and without that time that we spent saving for the trip, thinking about the trip, planning for the trip, getting the clothes together, getting our gear together, getting the right tent, all this kind of stuff, that trip wouldn't have happened. And to me, that illustrates the power of intentions, because if we had just kind of left it up to chance or fate or whatever, and we thought like, yeah, it'd be really nice to take some kind of big trip together as a family after Claire graduates, we would have come up to the time when I graduated. I would not have had money saved to be able to, spend on things that I wanted for the trip. I don't think taking a family of 5 to Europe is something most people can necessarily do without saving up for it for a couple of years in advance. So it took all this time of getting things ready for us to then have the right resources and have the preparation to be able to make this incredible trip that we were able to make because of our preparation. So if you're wondering, Claire, what does this have to do with coming out of the Bardo of the COVID state? Here's where I think it connects. Now is a really valuable time to take what we've learned about ourselves, about our values, about what matters to us, and really try to reflect on it, try to digest as deeply as possible. What has this time taught me about myself? What do I want to do going forward, and what do I not want to do? And I think the more that we're able to reflect on this and to really set our intentions as we come out of this time, the better we'll be able to not just bounce back, but bounce forward, as the Comcast ads say. I really love that, by the way. Not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. We're not going to be the same person. Can we be someone we would prefer to be instead of the someone we just kind of found ourselves being right before COVID hit? And that leads into the third point, which is that the new will not be the same as the old. And this is probably the one that I'm the least comfortable with, reflecting on what it might be like to go forward from this place. We know what life used to be like. And there was a lot of inequality and injustice and unfair distribution of wealth, unfair distribution of resources like healthcare. Like there were a lot of issues with the world as it was, but at least we knew what to expect. And I think it's actually scarier in some ways to think about what could happen next. So much of what people have been looking forward to is going back to certain things, going back to restaurants or bars, or being able to go and listen to live music again, being able to gather indoors, being able to just have basic human contact with people without wondering if you're going to give them a deadly illness or they might be giving you a deadly illness. And in the first sort of reflection about, what has changed, what we've lost during this COVID Bardo state, there's just been so much that's different. If I think about Houston, I've been kind of following along with some of the news of the economic impact of COVID on that city. And there are just so many restaurants. It's such a huge city, but it's also like very diverse and you can find every type of food. And I read at one point that up to 30% of the restaurants in the city might not reopen when COVID is over. So I think we've had this sense that once everybody's finally vaccinated, we'll be able to just go back out and like pick up life as it used to be. And I think the reality is that that's not what we're really looking at. I think we're looking at coming back out into a world where something has just happened and we're like the post-apocalyptic survivors, except it's not that bad, but it's not a matter of just picking up where we left off. I think realistically, looking at developments in the US, here in Canada, where we're full on having a third wave of COVID and some places are getting hit worse than they ever have been, and looking at what's happening in India right now with a much worse COVID situation than they had in the beginning, it just looks like it may be a long time before we're fully past this pandemic. It may be years. And that suggests that the new normal that we're going to be coming into over these next few months or year, or I don't know how long it's going to take for things to become more normal again, but I think we could be looking at a relatively long-term new normal that's significantly different from how things were when everything shut down in March of 2020. But I want to close on a hopeful note, which is that with any rebirth, there's so much that we've lost, but there's also this opportunity to have more intention and really be able to shape who we are and where we're going in a way that we just don't get when we're kind of in our groove, daily life is going along, and we don't have any particular cause to sit back and reflect and get intentional about how we're living our lives. And to me, that's part of what's really inspiring and hopeful about these Bardo teachings is that they offer us some ideas, some tools that we can adapt to this rebirth to try and get as much out of it as possible through intentions, aspirations, honestly, also through grieving and recognizing the value of what we've lost and trying to find ways to bring continuity between the old and the new. So to wrap things up, the experiences and the times that we're living through right now, none of us alive have lived through something like this. It's happened so many times in human history. And also, as the Tibetan Buddhist teachings on the Bardo state show, there's sort of a template for this. Every time we die and come back, if you believe in literal rebirth, or every time we go through a massive transition in our lives and have to renegotiate our identity and our time and what we're doing with our lives, it's like those also offer us a template for collectively renegotiating who we want to be, how we want our society to work. how we want to spend our time, individually, who we want to be going forward, the relationships that we want to feed, the parts of our lives that we want to feed, and honestly, the parts of our lives or the relationships that we want to let go of too. So I want to thank you for listening, and I hope this has given you an opportunity to reflect on what you've lost during this pandemic, what you've learned about yourself, and most importantly, how you can use these experiences to really be intentional going forward about the relationships you want to feed, the aspects of yourself that you want to feed, and the ones that you want to let go of that were maybe better left in the past. So I hope for all of us that we stay safe and healthy, and that this rebirth out of the coronavirus Bardo state is a joyful one filled with reconnections and lots of love. Thanks for coming along for today's exploration of the process of letting grow. If you found this episode helpful, please share it. And subscribe now so you're always in the loop. For links to more content related to today's episode, please see the show notes. See you again next week.